A broke billionaire helped two poor sisters, only for them to return with a plan that made him rich again. But this story starts with a man who had everything, until one brutal betrayal left him wandering the coast with nothing but the clothes on his back. One stormy night, he collapses at an old lighthouse, where two struggling sisters find him and show him kindness no one else would. But when they discover a hidden crate of forgotten wartime letters inside their lighthouse walls, everything changes, because these letters hold a secret that could rebuild lives or destroy them. And just as hope rises, a powerful enemy comes after them, claiming those letters belong to him. Now the sisters and the fallen billionaire are thrown into a fight they never saw coming. Will their plan save him, or tear all three of them apart? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The autumn wind whipped mercilessly through the concrete canyons of Manhattan, but Zachary Dane barely felt it. His whole world had condensed to the brass nameplate on the building before him. The Dane Foundation for Children's Futures. The letters blurred as tears threatened to spill from his eyes. Mr. Dane, is it true that millions in charitable donations are missing? Did you knowingly participate in your partner's embezzlement scheme? How long have you been defrauding your donors? The reporter's questions hit him like physical blows. Camera flashes exploded around him, each one feeling like another nail in the coffin of his reputation. Zachary's throat closed up as he tried to form words. Any words to defend himself. But what could he say? His trusted business partner of 15 years, Marcus Wheeler, had vanished overnight with their joint accounts emptied and a trail of damning evidence pointing straight at Zachary. "Please," he managed to croak out, raising his hands in a futile attempt to shield himself from the cameras. "I didn't know. I would never— Sources say over $50 million are unaccounted for." Another reporter thrust a microphone toward his face. "What do you have to say to the families who trusted you?" The families. The children. Zachary's knees nearly buckled as the full weight of the betrayal crashed over him. Every penny of that money had been meant to help underprivileged kids get an education, to fund medical treatments, to give them a fighting chance at a better life. And now it was gone. He stumbled backward, his expensive Italian leather shoes scuffing against the sidewalk. The crowd of reporters pressed closer, their questions becoming a deafening roar in his ears. Without conscious thought, Zachary turned and ran. He pushed through the mass of bodies, ignoring the shouts that followed him down the street. He ran until his lungs burned, until he found himself in a grimy bus station he'd never set foot in before. His hands shook as he pulled out his wallet, the only thing he had with him. The credit cards would be useless now. The accounts were surely frozen. But there was cash, $843, money he'd withdrawn yesterday for a charity event that now seemed like it happened in another lifetime. "One ticket," he gasped to the bored-looking clerk behind the scratched plastic window. "As far as this will take me." He pushed a handful of bills through the small opening, not even counting them. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of generic bus stations, truck stop diners, and sleepless nights. Zachary moved mechanically, eating only when his body demanded it, choosing the cheapest items on menus to stretch his dwindling cash. Each news broadcast he glimpsed showed his face, the story of his supposed crimes spreading like wildfire. He kept his head down, letting his normally well-groomed appearance deteriorate, grateful when no one recognized him. The coastal storm caught him by surprise on the second evening. He'd been walking for hours along winding roads, having gotten off at some small New England town whose name he hadn't even registered. The first fat drops of rain barely registered until they became a deluge, soaking through his once expensive suit in seconds. Lightning split the sky, illuminating a lighthouse perched on the cliffs ahead. It looked abandoned, its paint peeling, but it offered the promise of shelter. Zachary forced his leaden legs to carry him up the worn path, the wind howling around him like an accusing chorus. The lighthouse steps were slick with rain, and his dress shoes, now falling apart, provided little traction. He barely made it to the small, covered entrance before his legs gave out completely. Zachary slumped against the weathered door, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. As consciousness began to slip away, the rhythm of the rain seemed to merge with the pounding of his heart. His last coherent thought was of the children, all those faces full of hope and trust now betrayed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though there was no one to hear it but the storm. "I'm so sorry." The darkness took him then, as the lighthouse stood sentinel above, its beam cutting through the tempest in steady, unwavering sweeps. Zachary Dane, who had once commanded boardrooms and shaped the futures of countless children, lay unconscious on the cold stone steps, one more piece of wreckage delivered by the storm to this lonely shore. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last vestiges of his old life, while the lighthouse's beam marked time's passage with methodical precision, indifferent to the drama unfolding at its base. Each sweep of light revealed a man, stripped of everything but his humanity, though he didn't yet know that this ending would become a beginning. The early morning light crept across the weathered floorboards of the lighthouse keeper's cottage as Miriam Carter went through her usual dawn routine. Her movements were precise and practiced, born from years of responsibility. She pulled her thick cardigan closer against the lingering chill, making her way to unlock the heavy front door. The storm had raged all night, and she needed to check for any damage. As she turned the old brass key in the lock, she heard her sister Clara's footsteps padding down the stairs behind her. "Morning. I think the worst of the storm's finally—" Clara's cheerful greeting cut off as Miriam swung open the door. There, crumpled on their doorstep like a discarded newspaper, lay a man in what had once been an expensive suit. He was completely still, his clothes soaked through, his face pale against the wet stone. "Oh my goodness!" Clara pushed past her older sister, already kneeling beside the stranger. "Miriam, he's freezing! We have to help him!" But Miriam stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still gripping the key. She knew that face. Everyone did. It had been plastered across every news channel for the past few days. "Clara, wait," she said, her voice tight. "That's Zachary Dane." Clara looked up from checking the man's pulse, her eyes wide. "The billionaire? The one who stole from his own charity?" Miriam finished grimly. "We should call the police." "Miriam." Clara's voice held that familiar tone of stubborn determination. "He could die out here. Look at him. He's not exactly threatening right now, is he? Whatever he did or didn't do, we can't just leave him." Miriam pressed her lips together, studying her younger sister's pleading face. Clara had always led with her heart, rushing in where Miriam would cautiously tread. But she was usually right about people. Usually. "Fine," Miriam conceded, moving to help. "But if he turns out to be dangerous, then you can say I told you so forever," Clara promised, already pulling one of the man's arms across her shoulders. "Now help me get him inside before we all catch our death." Together they managed to half-carry, half-drag Zachary Dane's unconscious form into their small kitchen. His shoes left muddy tracks on their clean floor, and his wet clothes dripped steadily, forming puddles on the worn linoleum. "We need to get him warm and dry," Clara declared, already pulling blankets from the hallway closet. "You get some dry clothes from Dad's old things, I'll make broth." Miriam wanted to protest. Those were their father's clothes, and this was a stranger, possibly a criminal. But Clara was already busy at the stove, pulling out their last carrots and onions. With a sigh, Miriam climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. When she returned with a faded flannel shirt and worn but clean pants, Clara had somehow managed to prop Zachary up in one of their kitchen chairs, wrapped in every spare blanket they owned. His expensive suit jacket and shirt lay in a wet heap by the door. "I don't like this," Miriam muttered, setting down the clothes. "What if he's running? From the authorities?" "Then he's doing a pretty poor job of it," Clara pointed out, stirring the pot of broth. "Most fugitives don't pass out on lighthouse doorsteps." She paused, sniffing the steam rising from the pot. "Besides, something about this whole situation feels wrong. Did you see his face when the news broke? He looked devastated. Not guilty." Miriam had seen it, though she didn't want to admit it. She'd watched the footage of Zachary Dane being ambushed by reporters, seen the raw shock and horror in his expression. It hadn't looked like the face of someone caught in the act. It had looked like the face of someone whose world had shattered. The hours crept by slowly. They took turns checking on their unexpected guest, who remained unconscious but breathing steadily. Clara kept the broth simmering, its simple aroma filling their small kitchen with warmth, despite the storm still raging outside. It was late afternoon when Zachary finally stirred. Miriam was alone in the kitchen, updating the lighthouse logs, when she heard a sharp intake of breath. She looked up to find him staring at her with disoriented eyes. "Where?" His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "You're in the North Point lighthouse," Miriam said carefully, keeping her distance. "We found you unconscious on our doorstep this morning." Recognition and shame flickered across his face. "You know who I am." It wasn't a question, but Miriam nodded anyway. "I'm sorry," he said, the words seeming to cost him great effort. "I never meant to burden anyone else with my problems. I'll go—" He tried to stand, but swayed dangerously, gripping the table for support. "You'll do no such thing." Clara's voice came from the doorway. She swept in with fresh blankets, her natural warmth filling the room. "The storm's still bad, you're barely on your feet, and we have a perfectly good spare cot. You're staying the night, Mr. Dane, and that's final." Zachary stared at her, clearly thrown by her matter-of-fact kindness. "But why would you help me? After everything you must have heard?" "Because you needed help," Clara said simply, ladling out a bowl of broth. "Now eat this before it gets cold." Later that night, Zachary lay on the narrow cot in what was clearly a storage room, hastily cleared for his use. The foghorn sounded its mournful call every few minutes, a steady rhythm in the darkness. He could hear the waves crashing against the cliffs below, the wind still howling around the lighthouse's sturdy walls. The sisters had given him shelter, food, dry clothes, and not once had they asked him to explain or defend himself. The younger one, Clara, had chatted easily while serving him soup, talking about the lighthouse's history as if he were any ordinary guest. The older sister, Miriam, had remained watchful but not unkind, her quiet presence somehow reassuring rather than accusatory. Zachary shifted on the cot, his mind spinning with questions. The sisters were clearly not wealthy. He'd seen the patches on their clothes, the carefully rationed food, the way they saved every scrap and spare button. Yet they had shared what little they had with him, a stranger who, according to every news outlet, had stolen millions from children in need. The foghorn sounded again, and Zachary pulled the borrowed blanket closer. He didn't deserve their kindness. He didn't deserve anyone's kindness. But here he was, warm and dry in their lighthouse, while the storm raged on outside. Sleep remained elusive as he lay there, listening to the steady pulse of the foghorn, wondering what he had done to merit such mercy from two women who had every reason to turn him away. Dawn broke over North Point Lighthouse, revealing the aftermath of the storm. Scattered branches and debris littered the grounds, and the old wooden fence that bordered the property lay partially collapsed. The fierce winds had died down to a persistent cold breeze that whistled through cracks in the weathered buildings. Zachary woke to these sounds and the smell of cooking oatmeal wafting up from the kitchen. He sat up slowly on the cot, his body stiff from the unfamiliar bed, but grateful for the warmth and shelter it had provided. Someone had left a neatly folded stack of clean clothes by his door, simple work clothes that looked well worn but carefully mended. Downstairs, he found Clara stirring a large pot, while Miriam set out 3 mismatched bowls on their small wooden table. The kitchen felt different in the morning light, smaller, humbler, but somehow more welcoming than it had seemed the day before. "Good morning," Clara called out cheerfully. "I hope you slept well. The foghorn can take some getting used to." "I did, thank you," Zachary replied, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "I can't thank you both enough for your kindness." Miriam gestured to an empty chair. "Sit. It's just oatmeal, I'm afraid. We weren't expecting company." As Clara served the plain breakfast, Zachary noticed the careful way she portioned it out, making sure each bowl had exactly the same amount. The sisters didn't have much to share, yet they were sharing it anyway. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Clara spoke up. "Papa used to say breakfast was the most important meal for lighthouse keepers. He'd want us up before dawn, checking the light and making sure everything was in order." "Your father was the previous lighthouse keeper?" Zachary asked carefully, noting how Miriam's shoulders tensed at the mention of their father. "For 27 years, Clara replied proudly. "He loved this place more than anything. Well, except us, of course." She smiled at her sister. "When he passed away 3 years ago, we couldn't bear to see it abandoned, so we stayed. The state's budget for lighthouse maintenance keeps getting cut," Miriam added, her voice matter-of-fact but tinged with worry. "They're replacing most with automated systems, but this lighthouse has been warning ships away from the rocks for over 100 years. We couldn't just let it go dark." Zachary looked around the kitchen with new eyes, noting the patches in the curtains, the carefully mended chair cushions, the way everything was clean but worn. Through the window, he could see more storm damage, loose shingles, broken fence posts, scattered debris. "Please," he said quietly, "let me help with the repairs. It's the least I can do to repay your kindness." Miriam's spine stiffened. "We don't need—" "Actually," Clara interrupted, "an extra pair of hands would be wonderful. That fence has needed fixing for ages, and now, with all this storm damage—" She gave her sister a hopeful look. Miriam's expression remained stern, but something softened around her eyes as she looked between her sister's pleading face and Zachary's sincere one. "Fine," she conceded finally, "but just for today." Zachary spent the morning clearing fallen branches from around the lighthouse grounds. The work was physical and demanding, so different from his former life of board meetings and charity galas. But there was something satisfying about the simple task of making order from chaos, of seeing immediate results from his efforts. By midday, he had moved on to the broken fence. Clara brought him water and watched as he carefully measured and cut replacement posts from lumber they had stored in the shed. "You're good at this," she observed. "I wouldn't have expected." "A billionaire to know how to swing a hammer?" Zachary finished with a self-deprecating smile. "I put myself through college working construction, before the foundation." He trailed off, the familiar shame washing over him. Clara touched his arm gently. "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns. Doesn't mean they're all bad ones." In the afternoon, Zachary tackled the rattling window in the lighthouse tower. Miriam supervised this task closely. It was clear she didn't fully trust him alone in the heart of their home. But as she watched him carefully remove the old caulking and replace it with steady, precise movements, her guard began to lower slightly. "You really did work construction?" she said, almost to herself. "For 4 years." he confirmed, focused on his task. "Learned more about honest work there than I ever did in business school." The sun was setting by the time they gathered in the kitchen again. Clara had made tea, not the expensive kind Zachary was used to, but simple black tea that steamed welcomingly in their chipped mugs. The day's work had left him tired but satisfied, aware of muscles he hadn't used in years. Miriam sat quietly, watching him over the rim of her mug. She'd spent years dealing with wealthy visitors who treated the lighthouse like a quaint tourist attraction, who looked down on their simple life with condescension barely masked as charm. But this man, this fallen billionaire, had worked alongside them without complaint, had treated their home with respect, had shown more genuine humility than any of them. It unsettled her carefully maintained worldview. Later, as Zachary climbed the stairs to his borrowed cot, his mind was made up. He would continue working, quietly and steadily, helping where he could until he felt he had repaid some small measure of their kindness. Then he would move on, before his presence could bring any trouble to their door. It was the least he could do for the two women who had shown him mercy when the rest of the world had turned away. The foghorn sounded its evening call as he settled onto the cot, his body aching from honest work, his mind clearer than it had been since his world had fallen apart. The first hints of sunrise painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as Zachary woke on his borrowed cot. Sleep had been restless, his mind turning over the sisters' situation. During yesterday's repairs, he'd noticed concerning signs about the lighthouse's electrical system: flickering lights, warm outlet covers, the sharp scent of burning dust from the ancient fuse box. He couldn't leave without at least checking the wiring. Making his way quietly down the creaking stairs, he located the main electrical panel in the lighthouse's base. What he found made his breath catch: corroded wires, scorched connectors, and a panel that looked original to the building's construction. "What are you doing?" Clara's voice startled him. He turned to find her watching him curiously, already dressed for the day in practical jeans and a worn sweater. "This electrical panel is a fire hazard," he explained, pointing to the exposed wiring. "See these burn marks? And these wires are dangerously frayed." Clara peered closer, her eyes widening. "I always wondered why the lights flickered so much. But how do you know about electrical work? I thought—" She trailed off, embarrassed. "That billionaires only know about stock markets and champagne." Zachary gave a self-deprecating smile. "I started as an engineer before building the foundation. I personally reviewed all construction and engineering work in my companies. Couldn't trust others to catch the details that might put people at risk." "Wait here," Clara said firmly. "I need to get Miriam." Minutes later, Miriam's determined footsteps echoed down the stairs. Her face was set in stern lines as she approached. "Mr. Dane, I appreciate your help yesterday, but you can't just start taking apart our electrical system." "Miriam, look," Clara interrupted, pointing to the scorched wiring Zachary had exposed. "He says this could cause a fire." Miriam fell silent, studying the panel with growing concern. Her expression shifted from anger to worry as Zachary quietly explained each safety issue he'd identified. "I can fix this," he offered. "I have the knowledge, and it needs to be done before something terrible happens." Miriam's shoulders tensed, then dropped. "How long will it take?" "Most of the day. I'll need to replace the panel and rewire the major circuits." "We don't have money for new parts," Miriam said quietly. "I still have some cash," Zachary replied. "Let me do this, please." The sisters exchanged looks, Clara hopeful, Miriam hesitant but clearly concerned about the safety risk. Finally, Miriam nodded. "There's a hardware store in town. Clara can drive you." The next few hours passed in focused work. After returning with supplies, Zachary methodically replaced the dangerous panel, his movements precise and confident. Clara watched with fascination as he explained each step, while Miriam checked on them periodically, her skepticism gradually giving way to grudging respect. By early afternoon, the main panel was secure. Zachary moved through the lighthouse, checking each outlet and fixture, making smaller repairs as needed. Clara followed, helping to test connections and learning about electrical safety. "I never would have guessed you knew all this," she commented as they worked. "The news always painted you as just another rich man playing with money." Zachary's hand stilled on the wire he was stripping. "That's what everyone thinks now, that I was careless, that I deserved what happened because I was just another greedy billionaire." "Were you?" Clara asked softly. "Careless?" "No." His voice was quiet but firm. "I trusted the wrong person. My partner? We built the foundation together. I thought we shared the same goals, helping people, making a difference. I never imagined he was stealing from our charitable funds, setting me up to take the fall." As the afternoon light began to fade, they gathered in the kitchen. The lighthouse hummed with properly functioning electricity, every light burning steady and clear. Clara set cups of tea before them and asked directly, "Why are you putting in so much effort here? You could have just thanked us for the help and moved on." Zachary wrapped his hands around the warm mug, considering his answer carefully. "When everything fell apart, I lost more than money. I lost my purpose, my sense of who I was. These past weeks I've felt hollow. But here, doing actual work that helps people who helped me—" He paused, searching for words. "It makes me feel human again. Useful. Real." The kitchen fell quiet, except for the distant sound of waves. From her spot by the counter, Miriam watched Zachary's bowed head, noted his worker's hands cradling the chipped mug, remembered his patient explanations of the electrical work. She thought of all the wealthy visitors who had passed through their lighthouse, their hidden sneers at the sisters' simple life, their shallow offers of help that came with strings attached. This man was different. Her carefully constructed assumptions about him were crumbling, leaving her uncertain but curious about what other surprises he might hold. The setting sun cast long shadows through the kitchen window as they sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the day's revelations and what tomorrow might bring. The morning dawned grey and heavy with the promise of another storm. Weather alerts had been pinging on Clara's phone since sunrise, warning of high winds and heavy rain approaching the coast by nightfall. The three of them gathered in the lighthouse kitchen over mugs of steaming coffee, planning how to secure everything before the weather turned. "We should check all the windows and doors first," Miriam said, spreading a worn checklist on the table. "Then move anything loose inside or tie it down." Zachary nodded, studying the list. "I noticed some loose siding yesterday. We should secure that before the wind picks up." They split up the tasks, working steadily through the morning. Clara gathered the garden tools and empty flower pots, while Miriam and Zachary tackled the building itself. The lighthouse had weathered countless storms over the decades, but its age showed in every creaking board and rattling window. As Zachary worked his way around the circular base, testing panels and tightening loose boards, an odd sound caught his attention. He pressed his hand against a section of wooden wall paneling, hearing a distinct hollow echo behind it. "That's strange," he muttered, running his fingers along the edges. The panel seemed different from the others, slightly newer, as if it had been replaced at some point. "Miriam," he called, "could you come look at this?" She appeared around the corner, wiping dust from her hands. "What is it?" "Listen." He tapped the panel, then the solid wall beside it. "Hear the difference?" Miriam's brow furrowed as she listened to the contrasting sounds. "There shouldn't be a space there. This is an outer wall." Clara joined them, drawn by their discussion. Maybe it's old damage that was patched? Zachary examined the edges more closely. No, look. These screws are different from the others. This panel was meant to be removed. The sisters exchanged glances, curiosity overtaking their usual caution. After a moment's hesitation, Miriam nodded. Let's see what's behind it. Working carefully, Zachary removed the screws one by one. The panel came away easily, revealing a dark recess carved into the thick lighthouse wall. And there, tucked safely away from decades of storms and salt air, sat a wooden crate. "Help me get it out," Zachary said softly, as if speaking too loudly might make the discovery vanish. Together, they eased the crate from its hiding place. It was solid and surprisingly heavy, sealed tight with ancient nails. Dust coated its surface, undisturbed until their hands brushed it away to reveal faded writing. Letters, "Keep safe." Clara ran to fetch a crowbar while Miriam touched the box reverently. "I can't believe this has been here all this time. We've lived here for years and never knew." Zachary worked the crowbar carefully under the lid, not wanting to damage whatever lay inside. With a creak of protesting nails, the top finally lifted away. The scent of old paper wafted up as they peered inside. The crate was filled with bundles of letters, carefully tied with faded ribbons and protected by layers of oilcloth. Clara reached in and gently lifted out the first package, untying the ribbon with trembling fingers. "Look at the date," she whispered, showing them the topmost envelope. 1943. Miriam's hands shook as she opened the letter, remembering stories their grandmother had told about the war years, about secret loves and quiet acts of defiance. Her voice was soft but steady as she began to read. "My dearest Thomas, the factory is different without you here. Every morning I put on my coveralls and take my place at your old station, and I think of how they said women couldn't do this work. But we're showing them, aren't we? Just like we showed them love doesn't care about the color of skin." They spent the next hours carefully examining the treasures they'd found. There were dozens of bundles, each telling different stories. Letters between soldiers and their sweethearts back home. Correspondence between factory workers and their families. Messages of love and hope between couples who society said shouldn't be together. Different races, different backgrounds, all sharing their dreams of a better future. Some letters spoke of prejudice faced and overcome. Others told of small victories in the fight for acceptance. All of them painted pictures of real people facing real struggles with courage and determination. "These are incredible," Clara said, carefully rewrapping a bundle. "These are pieces of history that were almost lost forever. Real stories from real people who fought for love and acceptance." Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the first spatters of rain. They'd moved their find to the kitchen table, spreading out the bundles in careful order as the storm approached. "We have to share these," Clara said suddenly, looking up from the letter she was reading. "These stories deserve to be heard. We could transcribe them, put them online maybe. Let people see that love and courage have always existed, even in the hardest times." Miriam nodded slowly, clearly moved by the idea. But Zachary's face fell, his expression troubled. "I don't know if I should be involved," he said quietly. "My name, my reputation. It might do more harm than good. Nobody wants to hear anything associated with Zachary Dane right now." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as if emphasizing his words. Clara opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, a particularly strong gust made the lighthouse groan, reminding them of the approaching storm. "We should finish securing everything," Miriam said practically, though her eyes lingered on the letters. "We can discuss what to do with these once we're sure everything's safe." They carefully wrapped the bundles and returned them to their crate, leaving it in the kitchen while they hurried to complete their storm preparations. But even as they worked, Their minds kept returning to the treasures they'd found and the decision that lay before them. The first heavy raindrops began to fall as they finished their tasks, drumming against the lighthouse windows with increasing intensity. Inside, the crate of letters waited silently, its contents holding both history and hope, challenging them to decide whether to keep its secrets or share them with a world that might not be ready to listen. Dawn crept softly through the lighthouse windows, painting the kitchen in gentle shades of gold. Zachary hadn't slept much, his mind filled with thoughts of the letters and their hidden stories. When he made his way down to the kitchen, he found Clara and Miriam already at work, the wooden crate open between them. The small kitchen table was barely visible beneath carefully arranged stacks of letters. Clara sat cross-legged in her chair, hair tied back in a messy bun, while Miriam stood beside her, methodically organizing bundles by their dates. "Good morning," Miriam said quietly, not looking up from her task. Her fingers moved carefully over the delicate paper, treating each envelope like a precious artifact. Clara's face brightened. "We're sorting them by year," she explained, gesturing to the neat piles. "There are so many stories here, Zachary, so many voices that never got heard." Zachary pulled out a chair and sat down, picking up one of the letters. The paper felt fragile beneath his fingers, its edges softened by time. "Are you sure about sharing these?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern. "Once my name gets attached to anything these days." "These letters don't belong to us," Clara interrupted firmly. She held up a bundle tied with faded blue ribbon. "They belong to everyone whose families lived through these times, to everyone who's ever faced discrimination or struggled to have their love accepted." Miriam set down the letters she was holding and finally met Zachary's eyes. "The world needs these messages right now," she said softly. "These stories of courage and compassion, they're more important than any controversy about who found them." Zachary looked down at the letter in his hands. It was from a young woman to her husband fighting overseas, describing how she'd taken his place at the factory, despite everyone saying women couldn't do such work. Her words were filled with determination and hope. "You're right," he said finally. "These stories deserve to be heard, but we need to do this carefully, legally." He reached for his worn laptop bag, one of the few possessions he still had. "I can help with the technical side, making digital copies, checking copyright laws, setting up a proper platform." Clara clapped her hands together. "Perfect. I can handle social media once we're ready to share. And Miriam, you're amazing at organizing things." For the first time in days, a small smile crossed Miriam's face. "I suppose someone needs to keep you two from getting carried away." They settled into a rhythm as the morning progressed. Zachary set up his laptop on a corner of the table, researching legal requirements for publishing historical documents, while beginning to scan the first batch of letters. Clara read each one carefully before passing it to him, sometimes wiping away tears at particularly moving passages. Miriam maintained their careful organization system, creating a detailed inventory of dates, names, and topics. She also made sure they took breaks, bringing them cups of tea and simple sandwiches as the hours passed. "Listen to this one," Clara said in the early afternoon, her voice filled with emotion. "My dearest Eleanor, they say our love is wrong because your skin is dark and mine is light. But how can love ever be wrong when it brings such joy? I dream of a day when our children will live in a world where hearts matter more than colors." Zachary paused in his typing, watching as Miriam squeezed her sister's shoulder. The quiet moment of understanding between them spoke volumes about their own experiences with prejudice and judgment. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Zachary's laptop screen illuminated their tired but determined faces. They had made significant progress, Nearly 50 letters had been carefully transcribed and digitized, with detailed notes about their historical context. "We should create categories," Miriam suggested, studying their work. "Love letters, wartime correspondence, factory workers' experiences. It will help people find the stories that speak to them most." Clara nodded enthusiastically. "And we could add historical notes, explaining the context of the times, help people understand what these couples were facing." Zachary looked up from his laptop. "I've been thinking, we could create a website that allows people to submit their own family stories too, make it a living archive of courage and love." For the first time since he'd arrived at their lighthouse, Zachary felt truly useful. Not because of his money or his former status, but because of what he could contribute to this project that meant so much to all of them. As evening settled around the lighthouse, they gathered close to review their day's work. The kitchen was warm, with shared purpose, the sound of waves outside a constant reminder of the steady passage of time. "We're really doing this," Clara said softly, looking at the neatly organized piles of letters and the growing digital archive on Zachary's laptop. Miriam nodded, her usual reserve softened by the day's shared experience. "Together," she added, including Zachary in her glance. Zachary felt something shift inside him, a warmth he hadn't experienced since before his world fell apart. They were stepping into unknown territory, yes, but they were doing it as a team. Whatever judgment or criticism might come their way, they would face it together, united by these precious letters and their shared belief in the power of telling stories that needed to be heard. The lighthouse keeper's clock chimed 9, its gentle tones filling the kitchen. Outside, stars were beginning to appear in the clearing sky, witnesses to this moment of quiet understanding between three people who had found unexpected purpose in each other's company. Dawn broke over the lighthouse with renewed purpose. Zachary was already at the kitchen table, organizing their growing collection of digitized letters when Clara bounced in, her enthusiasm undimmed by yesterday's long hours. "I posted just a tiny mention on the local community board," she announced, pouring coffee for everyone. "Nothing specific, just that we'd found some interesting historical documents about the area." Miriam looked up from her own careful cataloguing. "Are you sure that was wise? We haven't decided how to handle this yet." "Sometimes good news needs to spread naturally," Clara said, setting a steaming mug beside her sister. "Like ripples in a pond." By mid-morning, they had settled into their roles, Zachary at his laptop, Clara reading letters aloud, and Miriam maintaining their meticulous organization system. The soft tap of keys mixed with the sound of rustling paper and distant waves. Around 11 o'clock, a gentle knock interrupted their work. Miriam opened the door to find Mrs. Henderson, one of their elderly neighbors, standing there with an uncertain smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, clutching her handbag. "But I heard you found some old letters from the war years?" Clara welcomed her warmly, pulling out a kitchen chair. "We did. Would you like to see them?" Mrs. Henderson settled in, her eyes bright with interest as Clara showed her some of the carefully preserved correspondence. "Oh my," she breathed, touching one yellowed page gently. "This reminds me of my mother's stories. She used to tell me about the letters she wrote to my father during the war." More visitors arrived throughout the afternoon. Mr. Chen from the hardware store brought stories about his grandfather, who had worked in a munitions factory. Mrs. Rodriguez shared memories of her aunt, who had fallen in love with an American soldier despite their family's disapproval. The kitchen filled with voices and memories, each visitor adding another layer to their understanding of the letter's significance. Zachary documented everything, recording names, dates, and connections in his growing database. Around 2 o'clock, an elderly woman named Martha Wilson arrived, moving slowly with the help of a cane. Her granddaughter Sarah supported her elbow as she eased into a chair. "I saw your notice," Martha said, opening an old leather folder, "and I brought something that might interest you." Her weathered hands trembled as she withdrew a faded photograph. Miriam leaned forward, comparing the photo to one of the letters they'd been studying. "Is this Thomas Wilson?" she asked, reading the name from the letter's signature. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "My father," she confirmed. "He wrote to my mother every week during the war. I never knew what happened to his letters." The photograph showed a young man in uniform, his smile bright and hopeful. The same name and service number appeared on several letters in their collection. Zachary carefully scanned the photograph, adding it to their digital archive, while Martha shared stories about her parents' romance. As the afternoon progressed, Miriam grew increasingly engaged with their visitors. When Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned facing discrimination for marrying outside her culture, Miriam's usual reserve cracked. "I understand that feeling," she said quietly. "When my fiancé's family learned about our mixed heritage, She paused, gathering strength. "They made it clear I wasn't welcome, that I would never be good enough." Clara reached for her sister's hand while their visitors murmured sympathetically. Zachary watched Miriam's face, seeing new depth in her careful handling of the letters. These weren't just historical documents to her, they were proof that others had faced similar struggles and persevered. More neighbors arrived as the day continued. Some brought old photos or documents of their own. Others simply came to listen and share stories passed down through generations. Each new visitor added another thread to the tapestry of understanding they were weaving. By late afternoon, their kitchen table was covered with photographs, letters, and hastily scribbled notes. Zachary's database had grown exponentially, now including family connections, dates, and cross-references that linked different letters together. "Look at this," he said, turning his laptop screen. "We're finding patterns. Soldiers who served together, families who worked in the same factories, couples who faced similar challenges. These letters aren't just individual stories, they're a network of shared experiences." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the lighthouse windows, their last visitors reluctantly departed. The kitchen felt strangely empty after the day's steady stream of people, yet somehow fuller with the weight of all they'd learned. Zachary stared at his laptop screen, mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just about publishing a book anymore. These letters could help people find lost family connections, heal old wounds, and show that today's struggles weren't so different from those of the past. With trembling fingers, he opened his email. Only one contact remained from his old life: Janet Morris, an editor who had always valued truth over trends. He hadn't spoken to her since his disgrace, but something told him she would understand the importance of what they'd discovered. "Dear Janet," he typed, then paused. After a moment he continued, "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I've discovered something extraordinary. These aren't just letters, they're bridges, between past and present, proof that love and courage can survive anything. Please, just look at what we've found." He attached several scanned letters and photos, along with his preliminary database showing the connections they'd uncovered. His finger hovered over the send button as doubt crept in. Then he felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. Miriam, offering silent support. Clara stood at his other side, her presence warm and encouraging. Taking a deep breath, Zachary clicked send. The email disappeared into the digital ether, carrying with it their hopes for the future and the precious stories of the past. Zachary woke before sunrise, his hands shaking as he checked his email. There it was, a response from Janet Morris. He read it 3 times, hardly daring to believe the words. "Dear Zachary, Your email caught me off guard. I'm retired now, but something about these letters. I'll drive up today. Expect me around 2 o'clock. Janet. He rushed to tell the sisters, finding them already busy in the kitchen. Janet's coming, he announced breathlessly. This afternoon. Clara dropped her dishcloth in excitement, while Miriam's eyes widened with concern. Today? She asked, looking around their modest home. We need to clean everything. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Clara scrubbed windows while Miriam swept and dusted. Zachary organized the letters into clear categories, creating a presentation that would show their full significance. He arranged the most powerful letters on the kitchen table. Stories of love conquering prejudice, faith sustaining families through war, and courage in the face of discrimination. At precisely 2 o'clock, they heard tires crunching on the gravel outside. Janet Morris stepped out of her car, a tall woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Zachary met her at the door, his heart pounding. Janet, thank you for coming, he said quietly. These are Miriam and Clara Carter. Janet nodded to the sisters, then turned to Zachary with a gentle smile. You look different, she observed. I am different, he replied simply. They gathered around the kitchen table where Zachary had arranged the letters. Janet picked up the first one. A soldier writing to his Japanese-American wife during World War II, promising to stand by her despite others' prejudice. As she read, tears began rolling down her cheeks. No one spoke. She reached for another letter, then another. Finally, she looked up, wiping her eyes. This is exactly what our country needs right now, she declared. These aren't just old letters. They're proof that love and courage can bridge any divide. We'll call it Letters from the Lighthouse, a beacon of hope for modern readers. Clara squeezed Miriam's hand as Janet continued. I may be retired, but I still have connections. Give me 3 days to make some calls. This needs to be published. Over the next 2 days, they worked tirelessly to organize the material. Zachary created spreadsheets tracking themes and connections. Clara typed transcriptions, while Miriam carefully photographed each document. They grouped the letters into powerful sequences. Courage Across Color Lines featured couples who fought prejudice with unwavering love. One particularly moving series came from an African-American soldier and his white fiancée, sharing their dreams of a future together despite facing hatred from both families. Faith Through Fire collected letters showing how belief sustained people through war and hardship. A factory worker wrote to her husband overseas, I pray every night knowing God watches over you. Our love is stronger than any darkness. Homefront heroes highlighted the sacrifice of those who waited and worked while loved ones served. A widow raising 4 children alone wrote to her sister, Times are hard, but we endure. The children need to see strength in me. Janet made countless phone calls, her excitement growing with each conversation. Publishers were interested, very interested. The project was gaining momentum. On the 3rd evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant orange, the sisters prepared a simple celebration dinner, the kitchen filled with the warming scent of beef stew and fresh bread. Clara hummed as she stirred the pot while Miriam set their small table. Zachary stepped out onto the lighthouse balcony, wrapping his coat against the cool breeze. Below him, waves crashed against the rocky shore. Above, seabirds wheeled and called. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath of salt air. For the first time since his world collapsed, hope bloomed in his chest. Not the desperate hope of a drowning man, but something steady and warm. These letters, this lighthouse, these remarkable sisters, they had given him more than shelter. They had shown him a new path forward. Dinner's ready, Clara called from inside. Zachary took one last look at the horizon, where dark clouds were turning pink with sunset light. Like those clouds touched by evening sun, even the darkest moments could be transformed into something beautiful. Smiling softly, he turned and went inside to join his friends. The kitchen was warm and bright, steam rising from bowls of stew. Miriam handed him a piece of fresh bread, her eyes gentle. Clara poured 3 glasses of water, raising hers in a toast. "To letters from the lighthouse," she said simply. They clinked glasses, and Zachary felt tears prick his eyes. Here, in this simple moment of celebration, he had found something he never expected, not just hope, but home. 2 days after their modest celebration, the lighthouse phone rang just after breakfast. Clara answered, then quickly waved Zachary and Miriam over, putting the call on speaker. "I have incredible news," Janet's voice crackled through. "Horizon Publishing wants the manuscript. Not in a few months, they want it now. They're offering a rush contract with a substantial advance." Miriam gripped the kitchen counter. Clara bounced on her toes. Zachary stood very still, hardly daring to breathe. "How soon?" he asked. "They want to fast-track everything. Can you come to Mason's print shop in town next week? We'll need professional scans of all the original letters." The following Monday morning found them carefully packing the precious letters into archival boxes. The drive into town took 45 minutes along winding coastal roads. Mason's print shop sat on Main Street, a weathered brick building with large windows displaying ancient printing presses. Inside, Tom Mason, a man with ink-stained hands and reading glasses perched on his nose, treated each letter like a treasure. "My father knew some of these families," he said softly, scanning a particularly delicate page. "This is history right here." They spent hours ensuring every document was perfectly preserved in high-resolution digital format. During lunch break at the local diner, Clara noticed people watching them and whispering. The next day's edition of the Mason County Herald explained why. The front-page headline read, "Fallen Billionaire and Lighthouse Sisters uncover historic letters of love and courage." The article told their story with surprising warmth. How Zachary had arrived broken at their door, how the sisters had shown kindness, and how together they had discovered the forgotten letters that spoke to the heart of human dignity. The reporter had interviewed Tom Mason, who praised their dedication to preserving local history. Within days, other regional papers picked up the story. Then something extraordinary began to happen. Letters started arriving at the lighthouse. Not just a few, but dozens, then hundreds. Elderly residents across New England were sharing their own stories of love, loss, and reconciliation. "Listen to this one," Clara said one morning, reading from a newly arrived envelope. "My father refused to speak to me for 20 years after I married outside our faith. Before he died, he wrote me a letter saying he was wrong. I've kept it all this time, but now I want to share it. Maybe it will help someone else heal." Miriam, who had always been the quieter sister, found herself speaking at the local library, then the Historical Society. Her natural dignity and deep understanding of the letter's significance drew people in. She shared her own experiences with discrimination after her broken engagement to a wealthy man's son who had rejected her for her background. "These letters," she told a packed room at the community center, "remind us that every generation faces the choice between fear and love. They show us what real courage looks like." Clara created a website, managing the flood of digital submissions and connecting with families across the country. Her natural enthusiasm translated perfectly to social media, where she shared daily snippets from both historic and contemporary letters. As their work gained attention, interview requests began arriving for Zachary. Good Morning America wanted him, The Wall Street Journal, NPR. Each invitation made his stomach clench with anxiety. What if they only want to talk about the scandal? He confided to Miriam one evening as they walked along the shore. What if I make things worse? She stopped and faced him. These letters teach us that running from fear only gives it power. Your story, how you lost everything but found purpose, that's part of the bigger message. The turning point came on a chilly Friday evening. Zachary had stayed late at the print shop, reviewing final proofs. When he returned to the lighthouse after dark, he found a stack of letters on the doorstep, held down by a smooth beach stone. Inside the warm kitchen, he began reading them one by one. A woman whose parents had been in an internment camp during World War II, writing about forgiveness. A man who had disowned his gay son, now seeking reconciliation. A teenager thanking them for showing that love could overcome prejudice. The last letter was written in shaky handwriting on simple lined paper. Dear Mr. Dane and the Carter sisters, when I lost my business in 1987, I thought my life was over. But starting again taught me what really matters. Your story reminds me of that lesson. Thank you for showing that falling down isn't the end. It's sometimes the beginning. Yours truly, Harold Thompson. Zachary's vision blurred with tears. He heard footsteps and looked up to find Miriam and Clara watching him from the doorway. More letters? Clara asked softly. He nodded, unable to speak. Miriam put on the kettle for tea. Clara began sorting the day's mail. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept across the darkness, steady and sure, while inside 3 people who had begun as strangers sat together, reading messages of hope from others who had found their way through the dark. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Clara's excited shout echoed through the lighthouse. It's number 1! We're number 1! Zachary and Miriam rushed to the kitchen, where Clara sat at her laptop, tears streaming down her face as she read the sales report. Letters from the lighthouse had debuted at the top of the New York Times bestseller list. Look at these numbers, Clara whispered, turning the screen. Over 100,000 copies in the first week alone. Miriam gripped the back of Clara's chair, her usually composed face breaking into a wide smile. Father would be so proud. His lighthouse is changing lives. Zachary stood quietly by the window, watching seabirds wheel past. His heart felt full yet strangely light, as if a great weight had lifted. The project had become something far bigger than any of them had imagined. Over the next few days, stories poured in from across the country. Veterans groups organized letter-writing campaigns to connect older and younger service members. Schools launched programs having students correspond with nursing home residents. Estranged families began reaching out to each other, inspired by the courage shown in the wartime letters. Listen to this, Miriam said one morning, reading from her tablet. A father in Oregon wrote to his daughter for the first time in 15 years after reading our book. They're meeting for coffee next week. The media attention grew steadily. Good Morning America did a feature on the Carter sisters, highlighting their dedication to preserving the lighthouse and its unexpected role in healing divided communities. Local papers ran stories about families reunited through letter writing, crediting the book's influence. Even Zachary's public image began to shift. Business journals that had condemned him months ago now praised his dedication to sharing these historical treasures. Several wrote editorials suggesting his earlier disgrace may have been orchestrated by others. The lighthouse itself became a pilgrimage site. Every day, visitors arrived, bearing letters, stories, and gratitude. The sisters welcomed them all, serving simple refreshments and listening to tales of reconciliation and hope. On a bright Saturday in early autumn, they hosted their largest gathering yet. Over 200 people crowded the lighthouse grounds, sharing stories and writing letters at tables set up on the lawn. Children played tag between the tables, while elderly veterans swapped war stories. The aroma of coffee and fresh-baked cookies drifted on the sea breeze. Zachary stood on the lighthouse balcony, watching the scene below with quiet satisfaction. A young reporter had just finished interviewing him about the project's impact on community healing. For the first time in months, he felt truly at peace. Then he saw the courier walking up the path, official envelope in hand. The legal notice was printed on expensive paper, the law firm's letterhead embossed in gold. As Zachary read, his hands began to shake. His former business partner, Maxwell Warner, was claiming ownership of all letters found in the lighthouse, asserting they had been illegally removed from private estates during wartime. Warner demanded immediate cessation of book sales and surrender of all original documents. The notice threatened criminal charges for theft of historical artifacts. Zachary's mind raced. Warner had lost millions in the scandal, his reputation destroyed. This was revenge, calculated to cause maximum damage not just to Zachary, but to everyone involved with the project. He found Miriam and Clara in the kitchen, cleaning up after the gathering. Their faces fell as he explained the situation. "But that's ridiculous," Clara protested. "These letters were abandoned here for decades. They belong to history, to everyone." "The legal costs alone could be astronomical," Miriam said quietly, always practical. "We barely keep the lighthouse running as it is." Over the next 3 days, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The publisher suspended all sales, pending legal review. Their bank accounts were frozen by court order. News outlets that had celebrated them days before now ran stories questioning the letters' provenance. Warner's legal team moved fast, filing papers to seize the lighthouse itself as evidence in the case. They claimed its historical connection to wartime activities made it relevant to their investigation. Zachary didn't sleep, spending nights researching legal precedents and property laws. But every path led to the same conclusion. Fighting Warner would be long, expensive, and could destroy everything the sisters had built. On the 4th morning, he found Miriam alone in the kitchen before dawn. She was staring into her coffee cup, looking more tired than he'd ever seen her. "This lighthouse is all we have left of our parents," she said softly. "We can't lose it." Zachary's decision crystallized in that moment. He couldn't let these kind women who had saved him suffer for his presence in their lives. Warner's vendetta was against him, not them. That afternoon, he packed his few belongings into his old backpack. He left a detailed letter explaining how the sisters could distance themselves from him legally, protecting their interests. He included contact information for several trusted lawyers who owed him favors. As the sun set, he took one last look at the lighthouse that had become his sanctuary. The sisters were in town meeting with their local attorney. He thought it better this way. No emotional goodbyes, no chances to be talked out of what he knew he had to do. The lighthouse beam swept across darkening waters as Zachary walked down the gravel path, each step heavy with resolve. He would find a way to fight Warner without endangering the sisters or their home. The lighthouse had taught him about courage and sacrifice. Now it was his turn to prove he'd learned those lessons well. Behind him, the foghorn sounded, low and mournful in the gathering dusk. Dawn crept over the lighthouse with heavy grey clouds threatening rain. Zachary stood in the small guest room where he'd found sanctuary these past weeks, methodically folding his few possessions into his weathered backpack. Each movement felt weighted with regret. The room, though sparse, had become more of a home than his luxurious Manhattan penthouse ever was. He pulled out a sheet of paper and sat at the simple wooden desk. The words came slowly, painfully. "Dear Miriam and Clara, I cannot express my gratitude for the kindness you've shown me. You took in a stranger when the world had turned its back on him. You gave me hope when I'd lost all faith in humanity. That's why I cannot allow my presence to destroy everything you've worked so hard to protect. The lighthouse is your legacy, your parents' dream. Warner's vendetta is against me, not you. By leaving, I hope to draw his attention away from this place and the precious history it contains. Please know that these weeks with you have meant more than any success I've ever known. You taught me what real family feels like. With deepest gratitude, Zachary. He placed the letter on the carefully made bed, shouldered his backpack, and took one last look around the room. The morning light filtered through the salt-streaked window, casting long shadows across the floor. Somewhere above, the lighthouse mechanism clicked steadily, maintaining its ancient rhythm. The kitchen still held the warmth of breakfast, coffee cups in the sink, the lingering scent of toast. Zachary paused at the door, committing these simple details to memory. Then he stepped out into the grey morning. The gravel crunched beneath his feet as he started down the cliff path. The first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against his jacket. The lighthouse stood tall behind him, its white walls gleaming despite the gloom. Each step away felt like tearing something vital from his chest. "Zachary, stop!" Clara's voice cut through the misty air. He turned to see both sisters running down the path, Clara in the lead with her red hair flying wild, Miriam close behind. "You can't just leave like this," Clara called out, catching up to him breathless. "We won't let you. I have to," Zachary said firmly, though his voice wavered. "Warner will destroy everything you have if I stay. That's not your decision to make," Miriam said, a quiet voice carrying surprising steel. "This affects all of us." The rain fell harder now, but none of them moved to seek shelter. Water dripped from Clara's hair as she grabbed Zachary's arm. "We're not some helpless women you need to protect. We're partners in this." "You don't understand," Zachary protested. "Warner has unlimited resources. He'll bury you in legal fees before we even get to court." "And you think running away will solve that?" Miriam stepped closer, her eyes intense. "The letters are already published. People's lives have been changed. You can't undo that by disappearing." "I can't watch him take everything from you," Zachary said, his shoulders slumping. "Not after all you've done for me." "Then don't watch," Clara insisted. "Fight with us. The letters came from real people, real families. We can prove that." But Zachary shook his head, gently pulling away from Clara's grip. "I'm sorry. I truly am." He turned and continued down the path, each step feeling like lead. Behind him, he heard Clara's frustrated cry and Miriam's soft words of comfort. The rain mixed with tears he couldn't hold back as he made his way into town. The seaside motel stood at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering weakly in the grey afternoon. Zachary checked in with cash, the desk clerk barely glancing at him. The room was clean, but worn. Faded wallpaper, a sagging mattress, a television that probably hadn't worked in years. He sat on the bed, staring at the rain-streaked window, feeling more alone than he had even in those first days after the scandal broke. His phone buzzed, messages from Clara that he couldn't bring himself to read. As evening approached, activity stirred in town. Through his window, Zachary watched elderly couples hurrying through the rain, many headed towards the community center. He recognized some of them from the lighthouse gatherings: Mrs. Henderson, who had brought her father's World War II letters; Mr. Collins, whose parents' love story had featured prominently in the book. Hours passed. The rain continued falling, drumming against the window in an endless rhythm. Zachary lay on the hard mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling. In his mind, he could hear the lighthouse foghorn, imagining its mournful call reaching out across the dark waters. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Miriam. "The original letter donors are gathering. They remember who gave these letters to the lighthouse. They want to help. Please don't give up on us." Zachary rolled onto his side, curling around the ache in his chest. The sisters had become the family he never had, Miriam's quiet strength, Clara's infectious hope. For the first time in his life, he'd found people who saw him, not his wealth or status. And now he'd walked away from them. The night grew deeper. Rain continued falling. In his sparse motel room, Zachary lay awake, feeling the weight of his solitude. The lighthouse beam would be sweeping across the waters now, guiding ships through the darkness. But he had lost his own way, adrift in a storm of fear and regret. The phone buzzed one final time. Clara again. "Family doesn't abandon family. Come home." Zachary pressed his face into the thin pillow, his shoulders shaking. He'd lost everything once before, when Warner betrayed him. But this loss, leaving the only real family he'd ever known, cut deeper than any financial ruin ever could. Outside, the rain fell steadily, washing the world clean. But in room 13 of the seaside motel, Zachary Dane lay alone in the darkness, convinced he'd lost the one thing money could never buy, a place to truly belong. Dawn broke over the coastal town, grey light filtering through lingering clouds. At the lighthouse, Miriam stood at the window, watching as the first car pulled into their gravel drive. It was Mrs. Henderson, her silver hair neatly pinned back, clutching a folder of documents. Behind her came Mr. Collins, then the Ramirez sisters, their aged faces determined. "They're coming," Miriam called softly to Clara, who was organizing papers at the kitchen table. "I told you they would," Clara replied, her voice thick with emotion. These letters belong to their families too. By mid-morning, the lighthouse grounds were filled with elderly residents. Some brought chairs to sit in, others stood in small groups, sharing memories and stories. The atmosphere was charged with purpose. These were people who had lived through wars, discrimination, and hardship. They weren't about to let their history be stolen. "We need to show Zachary," Clara said, grabbing her car keys. "He needs to see this." Miriam nodded, gathering her coat. The drive into town was quiet, both sisters lost in thought. They found Zachary at the motel, sitting on the edge of his bed, looking defeated. "Come with us," Clara said simply, holding out her hand. "Please," Miriam added, her quiet voice gentle. "There's something you need to see." Zachary hesitated, then stood. The drive back to the lighthouse was tense until they crested the final hill. His eyes widened at the sight of dozens of cars and people gathered around the lighthouse. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "This is our community," Clara explained, parking the car. "These are the families whose stories you helped preserve." As they walked toward the crowd, Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. "Young man," she said firmly, "my father's letters to my mother during the war are in that book. He gave them to the lighthouse keeper himself in 1945, wanting their love story preserved. No rich city man can claim them." Mr. Collins joined her. "Same with my parents' letters. They donated them right here, proud to share their story of overcoming prejudice. We all have proof, photographs, documents, witnesses." Zachary stood stunned as person after person approached, sharing their connections to the letters. Each had a story, each had evidence of their family's willing donations to the lighthouse archive. The next 48 hours became a whirlwind of activity. The lighthouse kitchen transformed into a command center, with Clara managing the documentation process on her laptop, while Miriam carefully organized physical evidence into labeled folders. Zachary worked tirelessly, his legal background proving invaluable as he prepared affidavits for each family to sign. The seniors came in small groups, sharing detailed memories of when and how their families had donated the letters. "My mother told me about this day every year until she passed," Mrs. Ramirez explained, pointing to a faded photograph of her parents standing in front of the lighthouse. "It was 1948. They wanted their story of love across cultural boundaries to give others hope. Throughout that first day, more evidence emerged. Mr. Collins found his father's original donation receipt, yellowed but legible, dated 1946. The Martinez family brought a diary documenting their grandmother's decision to share her wartime correspondence. As evening fell, volunteers from the Historical Society arrived with additional documents, lighthouse logbooks recording the donations, old newspaper clippings mentioning the collection, even photographs of past lighthouse keepers receiving letters from community members. The second day focused on organizing their case. Zachary set up a timeline on the lighthouse wall, mapping out when each letter collection had been donated. Clara created digital copies of everything, while Miriam carefully preserved the originals. The seniors continued, their vigil outside, rotating in shifts, sharing thermoses of coffee and home-baked cookies. Their presence was a constant reminder of what these letters meant to the community. "Warner doesn't understand what he's up against," Clara said that evening, watching another group of elderly residents arrive with more documentation. "These aren't just pieces of paper. They're people's lives, their heritage." Zachary nodded, his expression determined. "We'll show the court how these letters have always belonged to the community. Warner can't claim ownership of something freely given decades ago." Miriam worked quietly, methodically, her hands steady as she assembled their evidence into clear, organized presentations. Her own experiences with discrimination had taught her the importance of standing firm against bullies, no matter how wealthy or powerful they seemed. As the second day drew to a close, their preparation was nearly complete. Boxes of evidence lined the lighthouse walls. Signed affidavits filled folders. Photos, documents, and testimonies were carefully organized and labeled. The trio sat at the kitchen table, cups of tea growing cold before them. Tomorrow they would face Warner in court, armed with the truth and backed by an entire community's worth of evidence. "Whatever happens," Miriam said softly, "we faced this together." Clara reached out, squeezing both their hands. "That's what family does." Zachary looked at the sisters, then at the boxes of evidence surrounding them. Each piece of paper represented a family's trust, a story shared, a legacy preserved. For the first time since Warner's threat, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt purpose. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept across darkening waters, steady and true. Inside, 3 people who had become family prepared to defend not just letters, but the very heart of what the lighthouse represented, a beacon of hope, truth, and enduring love. The court hearing loomed just hours away, but they were ready. The truth of the letter's origins was clear, documented, and supported by dozens of witnesses. Whatever came next, they would face it together, backed by the strength of an entire community's shared history and determination. Dawn broke over the lighthouse with streaks of pink and gold painting the sky. Zachary stood at the window, adjusting his borrowed tie, the only one Mr. Collins had that still fit. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed down his jacket. Behind him, Miriam and Clara bustled about the kitchen, packing folders and documents into boxes. Outside, cars began arriving, a parade of elderly supporters in their Sunday best, determined to stand with them in court. "Everything's going to be okay," Clara said softly, touching Zachary's arm. "The truth is on our side." They loaded the evidence into Mrs. Ramirez's van, while other seniors organized themselves into carpools. The morning air was crisp and clear as their caravan of vehicles wound down the coastal road towards the courthouse in town. Zachary sat quietly in the back seat of the sisters' old car, watching the lighthouse grow smaller in the distance. Miriam drove steadily, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Clara reviewed their presentation one final time. The courthouse steps were already crowded when they arrived. Warner stood at the top, flanked by expensive lawyers in sharp suits. His smirk faded as he watched car after car arrive, seniors emerging with determined expressions and folders tucked under their arms. Inside the courtroom, Zachary's heart pounded as they took their seats. The wooden benches creaked as their elderly supporters filled every available space. The judge, an older woman with steel-grey hair and keen eyes, surveyed the packed room. Warner's lead attorney spoke first, his voice loud and confident. "Your Honor, these letters represent valuable historical artifacts taken from private estates during wartime. My client, as Mr. Dane's former business partner, has rightful claim to any assets discovered during Mr. Dane's occupation of the lighthouse property." Miriam stood next, her voice quiet but steady. "Your Honor, we can prove these letters were freely donated to the lighthouse over 70 years ago, with full documentation and living witnesses." She began presenting their evidence, starting with the lighthouse logbooks. Clara displayed photographs on a small projector screen, while Miriam explained each piece. This entry from 1945 shows the first donation, from the Wilson family. Mrs. Wilson's daughter is here today. An elderly woman stood slowly. "I'm Margaret Wilson Cooper, Your Honor. My mother gave those letters to the lighthouse keeper herself. She wanted their story preserved for future generations. I was there that day. I was just 10 years old." One by one, the seniors rose to speak. Mr. Collins presented his father's original donation receipt. The Martinez family shared their grandmother's diary entries. Mrs. Ramirez showed photographs of her parents at the lighthouse, dated and labeled with their donation. Warner's attorneys tried to object, but the judge waved them quiet, studying each piece of evidence carefully. Her expression grew increasingly thoughtful as more community members stood to testify. "These letters were given freely." A man in his 80s declared, "They're part of our heritage, our community's story. No one has the right to take them away." The Historical Society representatives presented their records next. Newspaper clippings, photographs, and official correspondence all confirming the lighthouse's role as a repository for wartime letters. Warner grew visibly agitated as the evidence mounted. His attorneys huddled together, whispering urgently. The judge continued examining documents, asking occasional clarifying questions. Finally, after nearly 3 hours of testimony, the judge set down her papers. The courtroom fell silent. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented," she began, "it is clear these letters were legally donated to the lighthouse decades ago. The documentation is thorough and the witness testimony compelling. Mr. Warner's claim of ownership is completely without merit. This case is dismissed." She paused, looking directly at Warner. "Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the State Bar Association for review of potential legal ethics violations in bringing this frivolous lawsuit." Clara grabbed Zachary's hand as tears spilled down her cheeks. Miriam closed her eyes, shoulders sagging with relief. Around them, their supporters broke into smiles and quiet congratulations. Zachary collapsed into his chair, emotions overwhelming him. The weight of weeks of anxiety lifted from his shoulders as Warner and his lawyers hurried from the courtroom. Outside on the courthouse steps, the group gathered in the warm afternoon sunshine. Hugs and handshakes were exchanged as people celebrated their victory. "Back to the lighthouse," Mrs. Ramirez announced. "I've got a pot of soup ready to heat up." The caravan reformed, this time with lighter hearts. As they drove back along the coast, Clara called ahead to neighbors who hadn't attended court. Word spread quickly, and by the time they reached the lighthouse, more cars lined the narrow road. The celebration spilled from the kitchen onto the lighthouse grounds. People brought food, casseroles, sandwiches, pies, and cookies appeared as if by magic. Card tables and folding chairs emerged from car trunks. Someone started playing an old guitar. Zachary stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the community he'd grown to love. Miriam appeared beside him, offering a plate of food. "You're part of this family now," she said quietly. "You know that, right?" He nodded, unable to speak, past the lump in his throat. Clara joined them, wrapping her arms around both their waists. The lighthouse stood tall behind them, its white walls gleaming in the evening light. Inside, the letters were safe, their stories preserved for future generations. Around them, laughter and conversation flowed as people shared memories and celebrated their victory. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The first stars appeared as the lighthouse beam swept out across the darkening water. On the lawn, children of visiting families played while their grandparents told stories of the past. The aroma of coffee and desserts wafted from the kitchen where Mrs. Ramirez supervised the serving of her famous apple pie. It was more than a legal victory they celebrated. It was the triumph of truth, community, and the enduring power of love preserved in faded ink on aging paper. The letters would continue to tell their stories, safe in their lighthouse home, protected by the people who understood their true value. The morning sun streamed through the lighthouse kitchen windows, casting warm patterns across the worn wooden table. Steam rose from 3 coffee mugs as Miriam and Clara sat down with Zachary, their faces bright with barely contained excitement. "We couldn't sleep last night," Clara began, pulling out a folder stuffed with handwritten notes. "We've been thinking about everything that's happened. The letters, the community coming together, all of it." Miriam nodded, her usual reserve softened by enthusiasm. "We believe there's a bigger purpose here, Zachary, something that could help people across the country." Zachary wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, listening intently. The sisters exchanged glances before Clara continued. "We want to start a non-profit organization," she announced. "The Lighthouse Letters Foundation. Its mission would be to heal communities through handwritten correspondence," Miriam explained, spreading out their notes. "We've seen firsthand how these letters bring people together, how they bridge differences and heal old wounds." Clara leaned forward. "We're thinking about storytelling circles for seniors, reconciliation programs between divided groups, mentorship opportunities for young people to learn from their elders' experiences." Zachary studied their carefully prepared materials, touching the pages gently. "This is incredible work. You've thought of everything." "Almost everything," Miriam said quietly. "We need someone to lead it. Someone who understands both the business side and the human side," Clara added meaningfully. Zachary looked up, realization dawning. "Me? But after everything that happened with my old foundation? That's exactly why it needs to be you," Miriam insisted. "Not because you were a billionaire, but because you've learned what truly matters. You understand how to rebuild from nothing, how to earn trust through actions rather than money." The kitchen fell silent except for the distant sound of waves against the cliffs. Zachary stood and walked to the window, looking out at the lighthouse tower stretching toward the morning sky. "We've watched you these past weeks," Clara said softly. "How you work with your hands, how you listen to people's stories, how you put others first. That's the kind of leadership this foundation needs." Zachary turned back to them, his eyes bright with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," both sisters replied in unison, then laughed at their synchronicity. Over the next several hours, they worked together at the kitchen table, drafting mission statements and program outlines. Zachary's business experience merged seamlessly with the sisters' compassionate vision. The storytelling circles could be weekly events, Clara suggested, making notes. "We could partner with senior centers, libraries, community centers, and recording equipment to preserve the stories," Miriam added. "Create an oral history archive." Zachary nodded, writing quickly. "We could develop curriculum packages for schools, teaching kids the value of handwritten communication and personal history." They worked through lunch, pausing only when Mrs. Ramirez arrived with a casserole having heard about their plans through the community grapevine. She insisted on helping with the reconciliation program concept. "My own family healed old hurts through letters," she shared. "Sometimes it's easier to write what we can't say face to face." By evening, they had solid frameworks for their first 3 programs. Letters of Legacy for senior storytelling, Bridge the Gap for reconciliation through correspondence, and Dear Tomorrow for youth mentorship. The next day began early with calls to non-profit lawyers and community organizations. Word spread quickly through their network of supporters. Local businesses offered office space, volunteers stepped forward, and a tech-savvy teenager designed their website. "We need to be transparent from the start," Zachary insisted during a planning session. "Every donation, every expense tracked and visible to the public." Miriam agreed, setting up careful accounting procedures. "Trust is everything." Clara coordinated with local media, arranging for a formal announcement. The lighthouse itself would serve as their symbol, a beacon of hope and connection in an increasingly divided world. By the second evening, they were ready to go public. The announcement was scheduled for the following morning, but news had already leaked through social media. Their website crashed twice from visitor traffic. "Look at this," Clara called out, checking her phone. "We're already getting emails from people wanting to start chapters in their own communities." Zachary sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and laptops, watching the sisters work. Miriam organized volunteer applications while Clara responded to media inquiries. The lighthouse beam swept across the darkening sky outside, steady and sure. The following morning dawned clear and bright. Local news crews set up their equipment on the lighthouse grounds as community members gathered to show support. Zachary stood between Miriam and Clara on the lighthouse steps, facing the cameras. "The Lighthouse Letters Foundation begins today," he announced, his voice steady and sincere. "Not as a charity, but as a movement to reconnect people through the power of handwritten words, to preserve stories that need telling, and to build bridges between generations and communities." Clara spoke next, explaining their programs. Miriam followed with details about how people could get involved. As they finished, Mrs. Ramirez stepped forward with a surprise. She handed Zachary their first official donation, a check representing contributions from dozens of local families. The announcement went viral within hours. News outlets picked up the story, emphasizing the redemptive angle of the disgraced billionaire finding purpose in service to others. But it was the mission itself that truly captured people's hearts. Donations began pouring in, from small personal checks to substantial corporate grants. More importantly, stories poured in, people sharing their own experiences with healing through written words, asking how they could help. By sunset, the lighthouse kitchen had become a makeshift command center. Volunteers worked on laptops, answering emails and organizing resources. The sisters moved between groups, directing efforts and maintaining their vision of personal connection despite the growing scale. Zachary found a quiet moment to step outside, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the evening sky. The tower stood as it had for generations, but now it represented something new, a beacon calling people to reconnect, to share their stories, to heal old wounds through written words. Through the kitchen window, he could see Miriam and Clara working with their volunteers, their faces glowing with purpose. The lighthouse had become more than a historical building or a maritime guide. It was now a national symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, connection and compassion could light the way forward. Inside, another donation alert chimed. Another story arrived in their inbox. Another volunteer signed up to help. The Lighthouse Letters Foundation was more than just an organization. It was becoming a movement, guided by the simple power of handwritten words and the enduring strength of human connection. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lighthouse grounds as Zachary stood on the weathered steps, watching seniors arrive for the foundation's grand opening. The salty breeze carried voices filled with excitement and purpose, a stark contrast to that stormy night months ago when he had collapsed here, lost and alone. Mrs. Ramirez waved as she made her way up the path, her grandchildren helping her carry folding chairs. Behind her, Mr. Chen pushed his wife's wheelchair, their daughter following with a basket of homemade cookies. More cars pulled into the makeshift parking area, bringing families, veterans, and community members who had become part of their growing movement. Miriam stood beside Zachary, her presence steady and warm. She wore a simple blue dress that matched the ocean beyond the cliffs, her usually guarded expression softened by the joy of the moment. "Hard to believe this all started with a hidden box of letters," she said quietly. "And two sisters who showed kindness to a stranger," Zachary added, his voice thick with emotion. Clara darted past them, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers who were setting up chairs and tables. Her energy seemed boundless as she organized name tags, arranged refreshments, and greeted each arrival with genuine warmth. "The media crew will be here in 20 minutes, she called out. "And don't forget, we're live streaming for our new chapters across the country." The lighthouse grounds had been transformed. Rows of white chairs faced a small podium, with the lighthouse tower rising majestically behind it. Tables displayed photographs and original letters from their collection, protected under glass. A banner stretched between two posts read, "The Lighthouse Letters Foundation, Illuminating Hearts, Connecting Lives." As 10 o'clock approached, nearly 200 people filled the chairs. Elderly couples sat hand in hand, some wiping away tears as they read the displayed letters. Young families settled their children, explaining the importance of this place and its mission. Local business owners who had supported them from the start stood chatting with new volunteers. Clara stepped up to the podium, her smile bright enough to rival the morning sun. "Welcome everyone to the official opening of the Lighthouse Letters Foundation. 3 months ago, this lighthouse held a secret that would change all our lives. Today, we're here to ensure its message of hope continues to shine across the nation." She introduced Miriam, who walked to the podium with quiet dignity. "When our father left us this lighthouse, we thought we were just preserving a building," Miriam began. "But we've learned that true preservation isn't about bricks and mortar. It's about protecting the stories that connect us, the words that heal us, and the love that guides us home." Several seniors stood to share their stories. Mrs. Ramirez spoke about reconnecting with her estranged son through their letter-writing program. Mr. Chen described how sharing his war experiences had helped younger generations understand sacrifice and resilience. A teenage girl read a letter she had written to her grandmother, bridging years of misunderstanding. When it was Zachary's turn to speak, he felt none of the fear that had once paralyzed him. "I came here broken," he said simply. A man who had lost everything except his shame. "But on these steps, I found something money could never buy, the courage of two sisters who saw past headlines to help a stranger in need." He paused, looking out at the faces before him. Faces that now represented family, purpose, and redemption. "This foundation isn't about me or my past. It's about the power of written words to heal wounds, bridge divides, and remind us that we're all connected. Every letter written, every story shared, every hand extended in friendship proves that hope isn't just a word. It's a light we keep burning for each other." The ceremony continued with the official ribbon cutting, performed by their oldest supporter, 92-year-old Margaret Wilson, whose husband's letters had been among those found in the hidden box. Afterward, people mingled, sharing refreshments and stories. New volunteers signed up for training, and visitors toured the lighthouse to see their heritage center and writing rooms. Throughout the day, Zachary watched the sisters in their element. Clara bounced between groups, her enthusiasm infectious as she explained their programs. Miriam spoke quietly with seniors, her gentle presence drawing out stories that needed telling. They had taught him that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touched, the bridges you built, the hope you restored. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting golden light across the waves, most guests had departed. A few seniors remained, sitting in chairs near the cliff's edge, sharing memories and watching the ocean. Clara organized the last of the cleanup crews, while Miriam stored away precious letters and photographs. Zachary climbed to the lighthouse gallery, the highest point accessible to visitors. The view stretched endlessly in every direction: the vast ocean, the rocky coastline, the community below. He remembered standing in his Manhattan office, thinking he could see everything important from that height. How wrong he had been. Footsteps on the metal stairs announced the sisters' arrival. They joined him at the railing, Clara on his right, Miriam on his left. No words were needed as they watched the sun sink lower, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Look," Clara whispered as darkness began to fall. Right on schedule, the lighthouse beacon came to life, sending its powerful beam across the waters. Around them, small lights flickered on in homes along the coast, creating a constellation of community. Zachary felt Miriam's hand slip into his, then Clara's on his other side. He was no longer the broken man who had collapsed on their doorstep. Here, between these two extraordinary sisters, he had found something far more precious than his lost fortune. He had found purpose, family, and a richness of spirit he never knew existed. The lighthouse beam swept across the waves in its eternal rhythm, now carrying a new message of hope. In its light, Zachary saw their future unfolding. More letters written, more bridges built, more lives transformed by the simple power of compassion and understanding. He had arrived with nothing and found everything. A broke billionaire helped by two poor sisters, and they had returned with a plan that made him rich again, in every way that truly mattered. Together they watched their lighthouse beacon shine across the darkening waters, knowing that its light, like their story, was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lighthouse grounds as paper lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, remnants of yesterday's celebration. Hand-painted signs dotted the grass, their messages of gratitude and hope catching the early light. Zachary stepped onto the balcony, inhaling deeply as the cool ocean air filled his lungs. The sight of the decorated grounds below brought a smile to his face, so different from the stark emptiness he'd found when he first arrived. Soft footsteps approached, and Miriam appeared beside him, offering a steaming cup of tea. "Beautiful morning," she said quietly, her presence as steady and comforting as the lighthouse itself. They walked together down the winding path toward the beach, passing volunteers who had stayed overnight in the guest cabins. The helpers called out cheerful good mornings as they gathered leftover decorations and tidied the grounds. Throughout the day, a steady stream of visitors arrived. A local high school teacher asked about hosting letter-writing workshops for her students. 3 veterans, their faces weathered but eyes bright, offered boxes of wartime correspondence for the Foundation's archives. Young families signed up to volunteer, children bouncing excitedly as parents filled out forms. As the sun began its descent, Clara gathered everyone at the lighthouse base. Her energy, even after such a full day, seemed boundless as she arranged people in a circle. "I need to say something," Zachary spoke, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "When I collapsed on these steps months ago, I thought I had lost everything. But these 2 sisters," he gestured to Miriam and Clara, "they didn't just save my future. They gave me something I'd never truly had before, a sense of belonging." As darkness settled, volunteers relit the paper lanterns, creating a warm glow that mingled with the sweeping beam of the lighthouse above. One by one, visitors began heading home, leaving behind echoes of laughter and promise. The three stood together, watching the lighthouse beam cut through the growing dark. The tower that had once felt like a symbol of isolation now stood as a beacon of hope for thousands. Zachary's phone buzzed, a national network producer wanting to feature their foundation's story on live television, another sign that their message was spreading beyond their small coastal community. Later, in the cozy kitchen, they shared leftover sandwiches and quiet laughter. The lighthouse's familiar hum filled the comfortable silence between them. Zachary pulled out a sheet of paper, his first handwritten letter in years. His pen moved across the page, thanking the sisters who had restored not just his wealth, but his hope. As he sealed the envelope, the lighthouse lamp turned steadily overhead, its beam sweeping across the dark waters beyond their windows. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.